it's recorded. So, well, thank you, Franco, first of all. I'm very honored to be here and to be maybe the first non-Italian speaker at this event. Thanks everybody for coming. My name is Olivier Tomat. I'm French. Nobody's perfect, but I've got an excuse because my wife, my two daughters, and my grandfather are Italian, so I'm almost one of you. I apologize in advance because that's a bit of a unusual talk here. I'm not technical at all. So that's not exactly the kind of talk you're used to receive here. I just hope it's going to be interesting. The initial question was when we were at a fantastic dinner with Franco, when he asked me to speak, was basically how does it work? How does the whole thing work? And I'm going to try and explain you how the whole Silicon Valley innovation ecosystem, even if I hate the word, works, and how it is different from the rest of ecosystems you might know, including Italy, France, or Europe. Couple of words about me. So let me just switch presentation because that's yours. Thank you. Yeah, it's going to be better. Okay, here we are. So research-based innovation in the US and Europe. I'm just going to state that I'm not talking about all kind of innovation systems, and in essence, I'm talking really about research-intensive, technology-intensive, science-based research in the US and Europe. Couple of words from me. So, like I said, I'm not technical at all. My background is in policy science and in economy. And well, I spent a lot of time running a couple of incubators, technology incubators in France and in the United Kingdom, and a couple of different organizations of the kind. Namely, the last job I had was running a membership organization that gathered research organizations, large corporations, and startups in the field of digital content. And the goal of that was to make all these people work together, which is not probably as easy as it is in France as it is here, for example. And then one day, at an airport, a girl I knew said, well, she was from the French government, and said, well, we're looking to send somebody in the Silicon Valley, and just see how the whole thing works. So basically, the talk I'm having today with you is kind of my job. And it was in 2014, and I just thought, well, I mean, Silicon Valley is just like when you're a soccer player, then you're invited to play in Serie A. I mean, that was the core, that was the art of everything. So I said, yeah, let's go and see what it is. So my job basically is twofold. I'm running a couple of programs, like a lot of people here, by the way, which are dedicated to bring French startups to the Silicon Valley, to make them connect to the right people, to make them set foot here. And conversely, it's a bit more difficult, but to bring American startups to France as a market entry for Europe. So that's part of my job. The other part is basically even more interesting. I'm constantly asked, why is Silicon Valley working so well? Why is it? What are the specificities of it? What is the magic formula of it? And so basically, I'm doing a lot of reports for the French government, saying how it works this way, the actors are like that, the whole dynamic is like that, and that's what I'm trying to explain a little bit today. And of course, that's a question which obsesses everybody in the world. And I mean, if you just look at that slide, I did that this afternoon. The number of places in the US and in the world that are kind of keen on being the next Silicon something, right? Silicon Slopes in Utah, Silicon Bayou in New Orleans, Silicon Roundabout, Silicon Alley, Silicon Desert, Silicon whatever you want, Silicon Garden of my grandmother, if my grandmother were interested in something like that. So that's really an obsession shared to the world. So everybody wants to not only break the code, but everybody is asking themselves, how can we be the next Silicon Valley? Well, not everybody, of course, because that's a quote from Tim Draper, the venture capitalist, and it was at a Europe Silicon Valley event led by a great Italian organization called Mindbridge. I think they are sponsors here. And Tim Draper said the only place, and that's right, the only place that does not want to be Silicon Valley is Silicon Valley. And more importantly, I think, Silicon Valley doesn't want anybody else to be Silicon Valley. Because they are really proud, and rightfully so, they are really proud on what they are doing. They are really proud of their uniqueness, and they try to spread the word that nobody can be Silicon Valley instead of Silicon Valley. And I mean, of course, everybody wants to be Silicon Valley. If you take a look at that, that's the average lifespan of the largest companies in the US, right? Standard & Poor's 500 index. And you can see rather easily that the companies tend to die, even if they're large companies, even if they're really great companies, they tend to die more and more young than before. And so there's a growing need to rotate the largest company in any national ecosystem, including the United States of America. And of course, the only place that has mastered this turnover as an art is Silicon Valley. And by the way, I'm saying Silicon Valley, but what I mean is really the San Francisco Bay Area, because you've got great things happening in Oakland, Berkeley, in all the East Coast, and in San Francisco itself. But I'm going to say Silicon Valley, if you don't mind. And so they've kind of shaped an economic development that's really specific, that's really based on young, innovative, fast companies. And the results are really good from an economic point of view. And that's the reason why the French government, the Italian government, any government in the world, any region in the world want to have the secret sauce for Silicon Valley. Because if you look at that, Silicon Valley is like what? 1% of the land, 9% of the population of the United States. But they have amazing results. They're the place where venture capital is most active. They are the place where patent registration is at an amazing height. Angel investment, merger and acquisition activity. I mean, this is really, really, if I was a lawmaker in California, I would be really proud, in Northern California, I would be really proud of what's happening here. And of course, this is an ever lively place. And I remember when we arrived in 2015, everybody was talking about the bubble. Well, valuations are too high, everything is going to crash down. Remember 2000, 2001, 1999, everybody will break down, California will be exploding, the whole knowledge economy will be dead. Well, I mean, if you look at that, it seems to me that it's doing pretty much okay. So number of deals, okay, nobody is reaching the peak of the year, the peak of the beginning of the century, because if you, well, you're too young for that, but if you remember these days, basically everybody was getting funded, right? And sorry for that, but any stupid website would get funding just by like that. So it just crashed down in 2001, but then it kept on growing and growing and growing. And the last 3 years have been amazing, each year breaking the previous year record. So it's really great. And it keeps on doing things. I mean, if you look quarter by quarter, because the previous one was sort of stopping in 2015, it's setting records every day. I mean, look at that. Look at its figures. 2017 has been great, both in terms of numbers of deals made, and more importantly, maybe the sheer volume of investment. And of course, it happens here, right? it's kind of stable, right? It's around 60, 65, between 60, 65% of the whole venture capital in the world is in the United States of America. Even if, of course, as you can see here, Asia is growing, parts of Europe are getting better at that. I'm a bit embarrassed to say that, but France is getting better at that. But, I mean, the supremacy of the United States of America, of course it says Americas, Canada is kind of doing okay, but it's the US. And inside the US, where do you find the venture capital money? And you know that, but it's kind of a non-changing trend. Most of the capital comes from California, and in California, of course, here, but most of the capital comes from here. From time to time, you've got great venture, I don't know, stage F, stage G. In New York, for example, we were. But most of the times, that means that probably more than half of the venture capital invested in innovating companies, in tech companies in the world, is in California. So the question remains, why is that? How does it work? Why can't we be the Silicon France, or there's something in France called Silicon Sentier or whatever. Why can't we be the Silicon something? And my answer to that, after 3 years of research and reports and discussions with my bosses in the French government, is because Silicon Valley has been really great at telling us a story. Has been really great at devising a very strong mythology. And don't get me wrong, by mythology I'm not saying this is a bunch of lies, right? Everything that everybody here tells you about Silicon Valley is true. Yes, part of the strength of Silicon Valley comes from the fact that they've got such a diverse population. May I just remind you that 51% of the people living in the whole Bay Area at home doesn't speak English. They speak another language, their primary language. 37% of the people living, 37% of the people living here are born abroad. So there's a whole story that is told that is absolutely true, and that kind of lays out the ontological, the essential superiority of Silicon Valley here. But then the way the story is told is rather interesting. And part of that is the history. Okay, everybody loves a good story based on history. This is how it went. This is how it came. So it can't be replicated. Be careful. You can't have another Stanford. You can't have another venture capital industry because it has been built on a ground that is not to be replicated. So you all know the story, and that's, by the way, that's a very, very strange thing. I mean, if you talk to the kids in France, for example, they know everything about the French Revolution, they know everything about the war, they know everything about what the president is, who they've been, etc. If you go to Italy, I'm sure they know everything about the Reunificazione, they know everything about the foundation of the Italian Republic. If you talk to kids here, including my own kids, because now they're more Californian than French, if you talk to kids here, they know everything about this guy. This guy is the son of Governor Stanford, who was one of the richest men in Palo Alto, and who, when his son died, decided to give $250,000 to build a great university. Right? They know everything about this other guy, who's the guy who basically invented Frederick Terman, who's the guy who basically invented Stanford, and invented Stanford in such a way that the barrier between academia and entrepreneurship was kind of destroyed completely. He's the first guy who invented the fact that you could rent spaces at Stanford and start your company there and benefit from the labs here and there, and benefit from the great research that was carried. So every kid knows things about that. Every kid knows about these guys who just invented the transistor and invented, for one of them, venture capital, and were the origin of many, more than more than 1,000 companies happening in Silicon Valley after the war. They all know everything about these guys. I'm not going to go along with history. And of course, they know everything about this. This is a great picture I love. This guy looks like thugs. But one of them is going to build LinkedIn. The other one is going to build, the other one is going to be Peter Thiel. The other one is going to be, I mean, this is all how it works. Great guys at very specific moments building innovative way of carrying entrepreneurship and changing the local world, building new models, right? But the real guy is this guy, and you know who he is. This is Paul Graham. Paul Graham is the guy who expressed the best the mythology of Silicon Valley. He's the guy who, by the way, invented Y Combinator. He's the guy who invented accelerators. He's the guy who invented the fact that we could, with a little bit of money and a lot of expertise, we could bring along many very strong startups. He's the guy who invented the contemporary model of Silicon Valley. And Paul Graham, in 2006, so that's 12 years ago, wrote a blog post. Of course, these guys don't write books, or he wrote a blog post. And the blog post was, how can you become Silicon Valley? Why? I mean, always the same question. And the answer was, of course, you can't, because there's no way to be a Silicon Valley. His answer was, you need two things. You need nerds, or geeks, and you need rich people. And he said, well, take Miami, for example. You get a lot of rich people, but nobody knows how to code, nobody knows how to compute things, nobody knows anything, so they're just rich retirement communities. And more interestingly, maybe, he said, well, look at Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh, they've got a great university, which is Carnegie Mellon. They've got absolutely amazing computer science departments, really, and still now, by the way. But nobody wants to live there, right? And especially nobody wants to start a company there because there's no money, there's no venture capital, there's no investment. So, nerds, rich people. Of course, there are other traits, secondary traits, like I said, immigration, that kind of stuff, but really nerds, rich people. And the only place, he said, where you can have that and retain these people, because it has to be a nice place to live, right, is Silicon Valley. But he said something different, which has been a little less noticed, and which I'm kind of eager to point out things about. He said, well, the last thing you want is bureaucrats. You don't want a public sector. And I mean, by the way, that's always what everybody says about Europe. Why can't we have Google or Facebook in Europe? So the first answer is always, well, but we've got Spotify. Well, okay. And the second answer is, well, because we've got too strong a public sector and it's bureaucracy and we're dying out of that and the state should kind of back up. And so Paul Graham said, yeah, we don't want bureaucrats. And I mean, it was really harsh. He said, well, yeah, it's like Vogue editors running a mass journal or anything. I mean, how more despising can you be? And I mean, I'm not a civil servant by choice, but I'm currently one. So I was like, well, I'm probably not like that. So I should kind of look into what he's saying. Is it really terrible to have civil servants around you, bureaucrats around you? And the assumption is that, right? You've got the private sector, so you've got yourself, you playing ping pong, building great things, being absolutely reactive, innovation, market, VC, ideas. Well, I mean, it's great, it's working. And then you got me, right? The gray guy, a lot of paperwork, a lot of graphs, a lot of charts, a lot of boring stuff, and I'm kind of member of that crew that kind of retain everybody from innovating. And that's the assumption. On the one hand, you've got that wonderful private sector, not to mention some sort of youthism, but okay, they're really moving fast, breaking things, and the other one is, yeah, let's get rid of the other one. And he's not the only one, by the way. Everybody says that, right? The Economist laid that out rather easily. Governments are bad, they're terrible at allocating things. So they should do really the basics, schools, workforce, market rules, whatever it is, and of course basic research, okay, because basic research is a common good, so they should kind of encourage that and leave the rest to the revolutionaries, right? Don't mess with the revolutionaries, don't prevent them from being revolutionaries, leave us alone, please. Wait. So look at the history of how it works. So I've got a first argument, and the first argument is, okay, the story about Stanford and everything is great. So Stanford invented venture capital, basically. Well, in 1958, there was no venture capital, right? Not at all. And the whole problem for the American government was, how do we transform the fantastic innovation system we've got from the war to something more economically viable, right? How do we spin out the great inventions we've got from the military labs to, well, economic development, ergo to companies, right? And nobody wanted to invest in companies. And by the way, I'm just saying that now, but when I started to kind of work with startups 20 years ago, nobody wanted to work with startups in Europe or in the US. Nobody wanted to do that. I mean, I used to spend a lot of my time begging I hate them, stupid bankers just to give overdrafts of 2,000 euros to my clients, right? Nobody wanted to fund startups in Europe, and in 1958, nobody wanted to fund startups. Nobody wanted to fund small companies in the US. So the US administration said, all right, we're gonna invent an instrument, right? And they called that the SBIC, Small Business Investment Companies. And what the Small Business Investment Company did between 58 and 70 was, well, they funded venture capitalists, right? They said, okay, we don't know how to manage that money, but we are gonna give you that money, and you're gonna set up funds, and you're gonna invest in companies, right? That's the beginning of venture capitalism in the US. And of course, everybody says now, and it's true, well, the model is broken, doesn't work, nobody wants a SBIC thing, etc. We can do that by ourselves. And of course, the venture capital industry in the US is flourishing, it's great. But the beginning of that was really the government. But that's one argument, that's not the main. The main argument is that. If you take a look at that, and of course it's from a book of 2012, but it hasn't changed really. Investment in innovation, right? So sorry, it's black and white, so it's not very readable. But the idea is most of the funding for innovation, right? If you take all the phases, most of the funding for innovation comes from the public sector. Early stage, seed, they're doing better over the years, right? And if we're going to now, it's better 10 years after than it was in 28. But still, most of the funding comes from public grants. And if you look at that, in orange, you've got the public actors, right? And you kind of see that the public actors, contrary to popular belief is, well, public funding funds early stage research, right? And when it comes to applied research, prototyping, blah, 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 this is only private. Well, that's not true, actually, okay? Public venture capital exists, NIH, labs, ARPA-E, they fund product development, right? So a lot of the phases of innovation, and we can discuss the model, of course, but a lot of phases of innovation are still funded by public actors. And so that's a very old slide I used 15 years ago when I was in charge of explaining innovation to different kind of actors. And the argument here was, well, look at that. Nobody cares really about R&D. Why is that? Because if you look at that, Nokia carries out like 4 times, and it got even worse after that, 4 times the R&D spending that Apple carries. So innovation is not a matter of R&D, right? Because look at Apple. They are the greatest company. Well, they were the greatest company in the world in 2018. They still are, and they're not carrying that much R&D. So who cares really about R&D? And the argument was, sorry, it's in French, but the argument was, well, because the innovation doesn't come from technology or science. The innovation comes from the fact that this magnificent object does everything. It's not a phone. It's whatever you want it to be, a medical file thing, a photo recorder, a music player. Well, you know the story. So the innovation doesn't come from technology or science or R&D. It comes from the fact that it's a usage innovation. Well, okay, but that's not exactly true. That's a little less known, but if you look at each and every key technology enabled in the iPhone, they all have been funded by public money. The batteries have been funded by the Department of Environment. Of course, I'm not even talking about the whole internet thing, but the GPS, Siri even has been funded by DARPA. Everything has been funded by public. And by the way, that's a really concerning problem, because when it comes to something that's really classical in economy, which is risk-reward, and in business, by the way, who takes the risks, who gets the reward, right? Well, the risk is when the technology is not mature at all. And things are a little bit different now. But when these things got out, well, every risk was taken by basically US government agencies. And it's not only about digital devices, right? This is NIH. NIH is National Institute of Health. What NIH does is they're funding everything. They're funding basic research, applied research, prototyping, first step of commercialization. And we're talking about, well, something in the region of $40 million a year, right? And of course, in 28, it has stopped growing normally because of the austerity. And when austerity strikes, it just cuts in that country. It just cuts the public spending budgets. But apart from that, that's a pretty consistent way of financing biotech and health innovation. Especially when you're in the case of pharma. Well, so 67% of the research carried out in pharma is just a variation of existing drugs. Different color, different dosage, different size, different whatever it is, different name, different... Only... Sorry?
Price.
Of course, price. Well, of course, price. Mainly, well, actually, if you take Amgen or if you take, I think that GSK, for the last 10 years, they spend more on marketing and on shares buyback than they spend on R&D. And the reason for that is, well, priority enemies, so the really innovative molecules, well, they're just funded, 17% of them are funded by public funding, right? So if you cut the whole public funding, then basically you fund the innovation in pharma. And then, as a result, you've got, well, price gouging and stuff like that, because that's the only way to make money. You don't invent. And by the way, I think there hasn't been a single new molecule on the market for the past 5 years. And of course, I'm not saying this is all about the public sector. I'm not saying that at all, right? And I really don't want you to say that. What I'm saying is the whole thing is complex, and it has to work both with public and private resources, expertise, know-how, savoir-faire, whatever you want to call that. And the example of that is energy, right? We've got a problem, which is energy innovation, clean tech innovation, is kind of stalling these days. And the reason for that is, well, there's been a large increase over the past 20 years in public sector funding, but then the private sector is kind of becoming more and more disappearing. Nobody already invests in clean techs anymore. And so we don't have the whole Xerox Sparks, we don't have these whole instruments that were fostering private-public partnerships, spinning out innovative companies. We're kind of missing the private sector. So the model doesn't work if you don't have the private sector. I'm just saying we need both of them, right? But both of them are, on their own regard, equally important. And so, and sorry if I'm a bit too long, but the real take on that is, yeah, the state can be, in its own kind, entrepreneurial. And the public sector can be entrepreneurial. It's not just a matter of, well, getting out of the way of innovation and correcting some of the market failures or negative externalities like pollution or things like that, right? They've got their part in playing. And we probably don't have much time for that, but I suggest you take a close look at how DARPA works, for example. And the reason I'm mentioning DARPA is, by the way, because the French and the Germans, and in no time all Europe, are kind of looking into, can we create that kind of agency? How does DARPA work? Well, DARPA funds projects through challenges, right? Robotics, smart cities, whatever it is. They are very small structure, 140 people. They don't have any layers of administrative things, right? So it's only 2 layers of management and stuff. There's a lot of rotation. They've probably learned a lot about the model here. There's a lot of rotation between workers, so nobody stays too long at DARPA. And they're funding a lot. Their annual budget, well, their non-annual budget for funding projects, right? Not paying the organization itself. For funding project is $3 billion a year. And that's only the part we know, because there are some other resource income for the projects coming from the Department of Defense that are top secret. So it works really, DARPA works really like a pre-commercialization startup, if that makes any sense. Innovation in the American government are not even nominated, so it's really like, let's collapse everything. And of course, the Trump administration is going after the great digital companies here. I mean, I don't know what's going to happen with Amazon, but I would be worried about them. So I would be a little worried about the whole innovation system in America. And the question is, what happens elsewhere? Well, I mean, we see a couple of, and I mean, we can discuss that later, so I won't be too long, but there's a strong model emerging in Finland, for example. So Finland, basically a one-company country, right? Nokia. Tekes is the innovation agency in Finland, and they did what nobody else did before in Europe, which is they invested in Nokia heavily, really, but they took equity, right? So when Nokia was sold to Microsoft, they took the share. And they massively reinvested this money into other companies. Well, into the whole Finnish innovation ecosystem. So they're funding Slush, and they're funding Slush, which is the startup festival, the largest startup festival in the world, by the way, like 10,000 companies, and they're funding a lot of Finnish companies. And that's how it works. I mean, if we're talking about an entrepreneurial state, then agencies, government agencies should start investing in companies in exchange of equity, which the Americans have never done before, right? So when DARPA funds the GPS, for example, and everybody takes, well, companies take advantage of that innovation, or when they are funding Apple at the beginning of Apple, right? Apple got a small business grant at the beginning. They are not taking any reward from that. Well, the Finns have changed that, and you start to see all around Europe, in France, in Italy, in Spain, In England, of course, a lot of government agencies saying, yeah, we should start to do that, because that's kind of, at least you're sure they're going to reinvest that in the innovation ecosystem. And of course, you've got the Chinese model, which is even more state-sponsored, and everybody kind of is dismissive of the Chinese ecosystem. Well, that's because it's state-sponsored. Well, yeah, of course it's state-sponsored. China is putting a 2.2 billion funds for energy startups. 2.2 billion funds. Who cares? Who cares if this money comes from the state? Let me tell you this. These very nice Chinese company, they don't care at all. And if you see how fast the electrical vehicle industry comes from China now, if I was Waymo or if I was anything here, I would be sort of terrified. Okay, last slide, last thing on that. The real stake for Europe is, what model do we want? Do we want a model where we invest directly in companies? And my answer is yeah. And by the way, I'm talking on my personal name, right? Not on the name of the French government, because the French government wouldn't agree one single on that. But no, it's important. We want to fund directly company. Let's have states or local governments, whatever, acting as VCs, right? Because the French are doing the exact opposite. What we're doing is we're giving tax credit. We're doing like the Koreans, the Canadians. We're doing tax credit. Tax credit exists here, right? So you're carrying research, you've got a tax credit, blah, blah, blah. Research tax credit. Nobody cares. 30% of the beneficiaries of the federal tax credit are claiming it. So that means that 70% of the companies that would claim it here don't even bother, right? It's not fueling innovation. What fuels innovation is direct funding in technology, from basic science to applied science to prototyping to first step of commercialization. That works. But that's just my personal opinion. I'm going to stop that because I'm seeing Franco is kind of fainting because I'm too long and too talkative. And thank you for your attention.
Okay, I guess there is, your presentation was very interesting, so I guess there is space for, also you were perfectly in time. You're Swiss, are you sure you're not Swiss?
No, I've practiced like 2 hours on this one, so yes.
So, do you have any questions? We have 15 minutes for questions, so.
Please.
Okay. You want a microphone or just?
No.
Okay.
Can we have the light?
No.
Yes, but Franca went away. We are trying to.
I'm sorry, but no, it doesn't matter. Go on. No, go on. I can answer your question without. Yeah.
Just a comment. Follow the money in all things.
Yeah, sure, of course. Of course, it's about that. But then again, it's also question the narrative always. What people. I love this country and I love this part of the world, and I want to spend the rest of my life here, which might prove difficult because I'm not technical. But having said that, everybody's telling the same story, right? And then you come first here and you go to see DARPA, and DARPA says, wow, we've made these wonderful things about robotics 8 years ago, right? We funded a lot of research organizations, startups, blah, blah, blah. Nobody knows. Well, people know, but nobody talks about that. And it has kind of laid the ground for the good robotic, for the second generation of the robotics industry, right? So follow the money, and again, question the narrative. People are just always telling you part of the story. And I think the reason for that is, because if we know the whole story, then there's going to be a serious problem of competition and things like that. So you tell a simplified and a very nice, and the whole narrative is very nice, right? The guy in Stanford, blah, 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 and then entrepreneur, and it works well. But the reality is a bit more complicated. Follow the money, question the narrative. That's going to be my motto. Thanks for the first part of the motto.
Okay. In the beginning, you had a graph that showed how long companies lasted.
Yeah.
And then now it's more like 15, 20 years.
Yeah.
Are they falling? Are they going bankrupt, or are they being acquired? Why are they more short term now?
Well, some of them die. Most of them are being acquired. Mergers merge. So if large companies are merging, for example, they are becoming a new entity, so they're counting as not existing anymore, right? So, I mean, there's a bias in the stats. I know, I understand. But the bias is kind of working all across the period, right? So the fact that it goes down just shows that, well, I mean, yeah, that's a bit more concerning. And actually, yes, and that's one of the strong and justified criticisms about Europe, which is our largest companies, they are kind of 100, 200 years old, right? And they're not moving. They're not being slaughtered, they're not being acquired, and they're not dying. But the consequence of that is the impetrants are not coming up the ladder. So you've got this sort of European national oligarchies of companies that are staying on the top, and that makes difficult for the rest of the companies to really develop. Whereas there's a sort of organic change here, which means that, by the way, if I was Facebook, or maybe not Google because that's different, but if I was Facebook or other companies of the type, well, we start to worry, right? Because we've only got 30 years left.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you for the presentation. It was very informative. Just some comments and observations. It would have been, I think, interesting to see kind of an overlay on some of your charts, U.S. charts of funding and public-private sector with French or Italian or other European government spending. It would be interesting to see that contrast. I think it would be pretty startling.
You're right.
The other thing that I didn't hear until about midway through your presentation was one word, and that was risk. And it's interesting when you talked about risk in terms of the public sector funding a lot of the innovation in this country. But the big question I have in my mind is, what is the perception of risk by the French, the Italian, the German, the Brits? I mean, what's going on in the educational system? What's going on in business? I mean, you went to a banker to get a loan for $200,000 or whatever it was. I'd never go to a conservative banker to ask for money for a startup, but you were a risk taker. So, what is the perception of risk in European countries, especially among young people who are going to the universities?
Well, that's a very interesting and very long discussion. First of all, it goes the other way around, right? I wouldn't want everyone to overestimate the power of risk. What I'm saying is, okay, we've got this habit of thinking, well, and Paul Graham said that, by the way. In the US, as opposed to for educational purposes, not for education, that comes from education. In the US, that's very different from Japan, from Europe, because we've created a nation of risk takers, right? So, first of all, from the money perspective, I still think that most of the risk is carried out at the beginning, right? Because if you're thinking about what you're funding in terms of technology, and take DARPA, for example, one out of 10 projects funded by DARPA are kind of seeing the light, right? So that means 9 out of 10 are dead. They know that. They're taking the risk. It doesn't matter. That's public money. They manage whatever, they manage it however they want. They're taking the risk, right? When you come to venture capital, I'm a bit less, well, I'm sometimes a bit more skeptical, right? I know some of them, and they're really good, but they've got to answer to their limited partners, right? You've got a fund, your client is your limited partner. It's not the companies you're working with. I mean, they're doing a great job, don't get me wrong, but when it comes to taking risks, well, I mean, if the technology and if the problems that you have to solve are taking 20 years, then that's not good investment material, right? So, and a lot of them, I'm not saying the top ones, but a lot of the venture capital industry in this country kind of boast about, oh yeah, we are risk takers, we're taking a lot of risk. Well, basically what they say is they launch 10 balls on the wall and see the one which sticks, right? And the other part of that is, well, where do the US funders, I'm not talking about the foreign funders, but where do the US born and bred funders, when do they come from? Well, they come from the best schools, they come from the best families, so in France, for example, there was, 3 years ago, there was, all the rage was about failed conferences. So you had like 10 failed conferences a week all over France, and with entrepreneurs saying, well, I failed, this was terrible, this was, okay. But then again, what's the risk, right? You've lost a bit of money, and a very strong percentage of French entrepreneurs are serial entrepreneurs, by the way. So that means that they've already made money out of one of their first companies, right, probably. So they can launch another 10 companies. If they crash, it doesn't matter. So the first answer to the question is, well, let's not overestimate the risk people are taking. Right? The second part, to come back to your question, the second part of your answer is, yes, you're right. Probably, and you're right to mention the school system, and you're right to mention the figure of the entrepreneur in the school system, and we're not yet there, and I'm sure. Having said that, I've worked a lot in Europe, right? Not in Italy, but in other countries. Compared to 10 years ago, if you're going to schools, if you're going to engineering schools, if you're going to business schools, if you're going to, well, an higher percentage every year, an higher ratio every year of these kids are thinking about entrepreneurship. And I remember 20 years ago, like I said, 20 years ago, nobody in Europe wanted to be an entrepreneur because that was really risky, and because they had the perspective of higher salaries and better careers in doing different things. I think it changes, right? I think it changes. The only question I have is it changing for everybody? I'm not sure about that, and that's a very long and complete story. I'm not completely sure of that. My point being, I think sometimes the people that think of themselves as risk takers are not necessarily taking huge personal risks, right? I don't know.
So I have just a comment to your question, and is that risk is also a function of how much public money do you have to invest. So it might be easy to say that Italy, for example, is less risky than California, but if you compare and normalize the risk in terms of how much public money you have to invest, it's actually all the way around. Is taking longer and much deep risk than California, just because the economy is not the California economy. So just one different.
You're right. You're right. And I mean, frankly, if you're a founder here, you start a company, right? So let's not say it's, and the less deep tech company it is, the easier it gets. You found a company, it doesn't work, right? So the great thing with accelerators and the pressure from investors, because they need results, right, is that you kind of know at an early stage that you haven't succeeded, right? It doesn't matter, because you've become a welcome member of the great family of entrepreneurs. So 2 days after, you find a job. 3 days after, you find a job. Oh, you find the funding, because have you seen how much funding there is for the past 3 years? So you see the funding to start another company. It's sort of a never willing thing, right? It never stops. So
It's a roulette wheel.
yeah, it never stops. So that's fine. That's fine. You're not. I mean, yes, you're taking risks, but not as many or as much risk as you think you're taking, I think, probably. Oh, yeah, sorry.
Okay. Daniele from Italy, from So I guess like from your presentation, it's quite evident that development of capital is of course important, but also like in addition to that, also the concentration of capital, like in a small area such as Bay Area or Silicon Valley. But on the other hand, we've been comparing Silicon Valley to countries in Europe, right? France, Italy, Finland, or something. So I guess my question is, do you think that countries in Europe should concentrate in creating clusters, or just spread out capital across the state?
Okay, I've got an answer to that. I just hope that the French government will never hear that. So please don't. The answer is yes, you're absolutely right 1,000 times, right? We have to stop thinking. Okay, I'm going to go even further. So my country has set up a very nice policy, which is called French Tech, right? It's about, supporting tech entrepreneurs and spreading the word that we are a tech country, and it works rather well. But they've decided to make cities compete against each other. So you've got French Tech Lyon versus French Tech, I don't know, Paris versus French Tech. Okay, this is stupid, right? Yes, we need to think ourselves, and I mean a lot of programs around what's happening here. We need to think in terms of Europe. For different reasons. A, critical mass in terms of market, right? One of the great advantages of the US is the size of the market. So we need to think in terms of a market. In terms of resources, financial resources, I mean, yes, the VC industry in Europe is getting better, but I mean, we are dwarfs, right? So let's put everything together. In terms of whatever you want, in terms of IP, intellectual resources, know-how, scientists, whatever. Yes, Europe is the right scale, right? Otherwise, you're going to be dead. That's my take, but I think you're right. Sorry, I've made you wait for ages.
I have two questions. One is related to this topic, and is what do you think is the incentive for these bridge organizations that are here in the Valley to get connected under the same umbrella? Because apparently they have different KPIs, they have different interests, they have to report to different people back in Europe, so it's not the same person.
Yeah, I know.
And then I have another question, which is more on the ecosystem. We have been talking about startups, investments, and large corporations. What is the area that you think is missing back in Europe right now, or in specific countries? Because I think it might depend on the country.
Sorry, come again with the last question.
The last question was, we talked about startups,
yeah,
investments, and corporates. Which of these three areas is missing in Europe, and how it's connecting with the other two? Is there something missing?
Okay, I'm going to answer the first one because that's the easiest one. And I mean, and I know where you're coming from, right? Again, like I said to you, if we're not doing that, I know I don't care about KPIs, right? I care about the good momentum. I care about the global results, right? If we're not doing that, we're dead. Yes, of course, we've got different KPIs. Of course, we've got different way of measuring things, and that's one of the problems with European governments is we measure too much. We've got too many disputable KPIs. We've got and too different, etc. We need to have, and I know it's not that easy, but we need to have some sort of supranational authority overseeing the whole thing and saying, oh, these are the KPIs, and now shut up. No, I mean, seriously, right? So, namely, we need to have the European Commission, and by the way, I've got a great hope, which is all the things I've said here are kind of inspired directly by a very good scientist from the University of Sussex, who happens to be Italian, who's called Mariana Mazzucato. And Mariana Mazzucato is now an advisor to the European whole public system. So maybe it's going to work there. We need them to say, yeah, stop. We need to have these three indicators and work together on that, and that's it, and no more France. Right. On that part, we need that, right?
I had a comment on this because it looks like France in CES had a huge presence, while other countries were completely disappearing in the scene out there. So
yeah, exactly that. Exactly that. Okay, you're talking about CS. I was at a meeting here with a European Institute, and everybody was saying, oh yeah, what's the European presence at CS, etc. Personally, I don't think we need to send companies to CS. I think that's stupid, right? We can boast that we have 120 companies at CS, but what do they do at CS? I'm not sure. Well, I'm sure. Well, okay. But apart from that, we should have done a very simple thing, saying, yes, we put a European thing, and whatever is the best system for bringing European national companies to CES, we extend that to the whole of European companies and we bring them together. That's one way thing, and I know there are problems of sovereignties, but Chinese don't have, and they're a fairly large country, they don't have that kind of problem. You never see a Guangzhou or a Shanghai pavilion at any, right? So, yes, of course, and I know we're responsible for that as French, don't say that. But yes, there's no other way. It's a question of critical mass. Second question, do we have time?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know. It's complicated because the DNA, and I just hope I don't have too many representatives of that here, but the DNA of European large companies are really different. And I've been working a lot over the years, not now, but over the years, on basically open innovation stuff, inside incubation, all that kind of stuff. The difference between most of the companies here is the largest companies, well, some of the large companies are fairly young, so they know, they kind of have that DNA in mind, right? So when Google works with startups, they know how it works, they know, okay, they are not startups anymore, but they're part of the same DNA, right? When large European companies work with startups, or even worse, with academia, doesn't work that well, right? One thing that's striking here is the pervasiveness between academia and large companies. The new chairman of Google, of Alphabet, sorry. The new chairman of Alphabet is the former president of Stanford, right? Can you imagine 1 millisecond the president of one of our universities becoming the head of one of our large companies in Europe? So, no, the answer is no. So I think the key is really changing the habit, the mindset of large companies in Europe. And it's not easy because we've tried to do that over the years. You've tried that, I've tried that, a lot of people have tried that. And the result is now we're fighting a very worrying tendency of large European companies, which is startup washing, right? So it's incubation, incubation hackathons, blah, 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 all over the place, where basically they're kind of stealing startups' modus operandi, right? They're not partnering. They're not used to partner with small, large, disruptive, chaotic companies. So, same answer as previously about the educational system. We need to educate the large companies. And I think one of the main way to do that is they need to buy out people. They need to buy out people from startups. They need to incorporate them inside what they're doing. One of the problems with large companies in Europe, and I'm not mentioning what, but let's say a large French pharmaceutical company I know very well of. The problem with that is one day they decided they wanted a head of external innovation, which is basically, okay, don't mess with our core business, our core molecules, blah, blah, but think about whatever you want in terms of. So they found a guy who had a fairly well growing startup. They kind of bought the startup, took the guy, shut down the startup, and took the guy and said, okay, you're our head of external innovation. And the guy didn't, for 2 years, and well, he's a friend of mine, so I know the story very well. For 2 years, the guy couldn't work. He was in an office, and every time he kind of laid out contacts, idea, connections, way of making teams work, Everybody said, no, you can't do that. No, that's too not like what we're used to do. And the guy left after 2 years. And I've got countless examples of that. So we need to educate them, and for that we need to bring people from startups. We need to bring people from academia. We need to bring people from a different mindset than the one we've got in large companies. But the same goes with academia, by the way, but that's a bit more difficult. Yes?
Just one brief comment. When you were referring to universities,
Yeah.
American versus
Yeah.
European, many American universities are not afraid to bring someone to the top from industry.
Yes.
So, so like you mentioned Stanford, you bring somebody from not academia
Yeah.
to become the head of your, I'm not thinking of any particular place in California nearby East Bay, but you bring somebody in from totally outside.
Yeah.
They have a different vision.
Yeah.
So when they transition out and go back to become the head of Google or someplace, they've been there before.
Yeah.
So the culture in, you know, I mean, the best tech school is not Caltech, it's someplace in India. I mean, but we can't get in those schools, they won't let us in. Chinese kids say they wanna come here because they're allowed the freedom of giving the answer they believe is correct rather than the answer that the professor wants, or they won't pass. So you really can't compare, in some ways, the institutions. Plus, American kids don't want to take any. I taught at one of the schools in the area. I had more. English is not my first language, so let me just preface it by saying that. I had more kids in my class that sounded like me when I was young than I had that sound like me now.
Yeah.
American kids are lazy. They just don't want to break their
I kind of.
butts to challenge it. They could do it, but they don't want to. So we are a partnership, whether we want to admit it or not. We aren't going to succeed in this country if it's not for inquisitive minds from other places.
Oh yeah, definitely.
And I think people just leave. I mean, you know, they may have left after World War II to come here for a lot of reasons different than today. But I think for an academic freedom, kids come here.
Yeah.
It's just a better startup, better incubator, better place to grow and learn.
Well, a couple of comments on. I mean, I agree generally.
No, but I mean, I think maybe that's what stifles some of the European thinking if the talent comes here, with the exception of India.
Yeah,
Or
sure. And not only Europeans, but from all over the world.
Yeah.
I mean,
that's just an observation I have.
Yeah, no, you're right. And I mean, if you even, well, I mean, that's sort of a retroactive loop, right? Because a large part of the best universities in the world are here, so they attract a lot. University of California, which is where I work. I'm lucky enough to work, right?
I'm sorry, I wasn't referring to.
No. But I mean, that's the most fascinating place I've ever seen. But University of California has a problem, right? They've got a business model problem. Stanford, that's different. Stanford, they are kind of sitting on a treasure of $40 billion gifts, right? From all the VCs, from all the rich guys from the coming from Stanford. So Stanford doesn't have a problem. University of California has a problem, which is they used to have a lot of money from the state. They don't anymore. And so how do you balance your budget? They're losing 1 million a year or something like that, or 15 million a year. So I can't remember. So the answer to that is, part of the answer to that is let's bring more and more people from the outside, right? So they are deploying a very strong strategy to bring people. And if you're in Berkeley during winter break, well, the university is still lively because the only students left are people from far abroad, namely from Asia and namely from China. So you've got a lot of people and they're attracting a lot of people. But your comment is absolutely fair about the pervasiveness between academia and the rest of that. And part of this, I think, is due to mindset. Part of this is due to rules, right? And part of that is due to why hasn't any major company in Europe over the past 20 years that I know of at least has hired at the head a prestigious guy from a university? No one has ever done that, right? We want business guys, we want guys from business schools, we want guys from the industry, from the same industry, always from the same industry. Here, you can come from a different industry, you can come from academia, you can come from anywhere, as long as you're good, exceptional, okay? So, you can change the rule, you can change the mindset, you can change the rules as well. If you're, for example, head of AI, to come with an example I know of, if you're head of AI at a fairly large company and one of the top universities here, well, namely Berkeley, wants to recruit you, they've got to put money on the table. They do, right? We don't put money on the table for academics in Europe. Never. We never do that, right? So if Google wants a new chairman, well, they call the guy from Stanford and say, okay, we're going to pay you that as a job. Well, that's fine. He's coming. So we've got to learn, I think, a little bit more in terms of, well, academic people are really good. They're really masterminds. They're really geniuses for some of them. So we should bring them on board. And it doesn't matter if they haven't run a 20,000 people company for the past 15 years. It doesn't matter. They can be really good as well. The other part is, well, if you go to any university here, they've got University of Berkeley, California. I love them. That's the reason why I'm mentioning them. But they've got 15 incubators/accelerators. They've got 3 seed funding instruments. They've got prototyping open to startups. Stanford, by the way, Stanford worked. One of the reasons why Stanford worked and Route 128 in Massachusetts worked a little less well was the simple fact that when you wanted to rent an office at the Stanford Research Institute when you were a startup, it costed 5 times less than it costed in Cambridge, Massachusetts, right? And you had the right to use the labs, and you had the right to discuss and work with the academia, right? Which wasn't the case in Cambridge. So, again, you're right. Your comment is absolutely right. But there are ways of working this, and this is probably the way the university works here, apart from the financial model, right? That's a bit different, but the way the university deploys some sort of instruments, tools, etc., to encourage pervasiveness and therefore entrepreneurship is easily replicable, and we should do that. And hopefully that's going to be one of my next jobs. But I want to do.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm too talkative. Sorry. Okay. Thanks.
Oh, thank you very much. Okay, you are all invited for the next presentation on May 10 with Paola Rossaro in conversation with Michele Orsino about API performance. Okay, don't be scared by the title. It's going to be a very nice conversation. Okay.